All right, so you want to know more about Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum? Well, buckle up. We've got a whole stack of sources here, from like that neutral Wikipedia to some articles that are like really digging into the controversies. And we even found this YouTube documentary, which, could be pretty out there.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how all these different perspectives frame the whole narrative around the WEF.
Right. Like, what are they even trying to do? So our mission today, I guess, is to like piece together the story of this organization, right? Its founder and how it's shaping the world. The good, the bad, all of it. Where should we even begin with all this?
Well, you can't really talk about the WEF without talking about the man himself, right? Klaus Schwab. His life is like a history lesson all on its own.
Okay, yeah, let's start there. So he's born in Germany in 1938. Talk about a moment in history. And his father was a director for a company called Escher Wyss AG. And get this, they made flamethrowers for the Nazi regime.
Wow. That's not something you forget easily. Growing up in post-war Germany with that kind of family legacy makes you wonder how it shaped his whole outlook on the world, right? Did that plant the seeds for him wanting to influence global systems later on?
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. But then he goes on to have this crazy, impressive academic career, degrees in mechanical engineering economics, a PhD from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich A&D, a Master of Public Administration from Harvard. It's like he was training for world domination or something.
Yeah. And it's interesting how that engineering background might explain his focus on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, right? That's something he really pushed with the WEF. And then his economics background probably shaped the organization's focus on stakeholder capitalism.
So all those seemingly random academic paths, they actually come together later on in his work. I wonder if that was intentional. And speaking of influential institutions, we can't forget about Schwab's time at Harvard, right? Especially his connection with Henry Kissinger.
Oh, yeah, Kissinger. The king of real politics.
Right.
His ideas about understanding and shaping global systems through strategic alliances and focusing on national interest, that stuff probably had a huge impact on how Schwab thinks. You could almost see a direct line from Kissinger's approach to international relations to how Schwab envisioned the WEF, as this platform for global dialogue and influence.
Okay, so we've got Schwab, this product of his time shaped by post-war Germany, hanging out with big thinkers like Kissinger. And then he starts his career first as a director at a Swiss engineering firm, then a professor, and finally he creates the WEF. It's like he was building towards something big all along.
Totally. Like he was gathering all these pieces, engineering, economics, politics, and then using them to build this incredibly ambitious project. Which, speaking of the World Economic Forum, it actually had some pretty humble beginnings.
Oh, yeah, I totally forgot about that. It started in 1971, right? Not as the global powerhouse we know today, but as the European Management Forum. And the goal was to bring American management practices to European firms. It's kind of funny when you think about what it became.
I know, right? People think of the WEF as this global force from the start. But it's interesting to see how specific its origins were.
For sure. And there's this great story about the first meeting in Davos. Over 400 people showed up, which is surprising because Schwab wasn't exactly a celebrity back then. But then attendance dropped the next year because Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard. Talk about a curveball.
Yeah. It shows you that even with the best plans, global events can totally throw you off.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to Schwab's, resilience, that he was able to navigate all that early chaos. What's interesting is how he used international figures and even global crises to make the forum more and more relevant.
So it's like he was always looking for those moments where the world needed something.
Yeah.
And he positioned the WEF to be that something.
Exactly. He brought in prominent people like Dom Helder Camara, the Brazilian archbishop who fought against poverty. It broadened the appeal. And then there's that fascinating example of the agency dispute between Greece and Turkey in the 80s.
Oh, right. Where the WEF helped them reach an agreement. That must have been a turning point for Schwab, right? Cementing the forum as a real player on the global stage.
It definitely was. He seemed to see these global tensions as opportunities to show what the WEF could do. And it worked. The organization grew, membership fees and revenue went up. And it evolved into this platform for tackling huge issues like climate change and digital transformation.
It's like that constant need to prove itself in the face of global challenges is what made it so powerful. But of course, with all that growth came more scrutiny, right?
Absolutely.
There were controversies about Schwab's personal wealth, people questioning those executive salaries. And of course, the criticism about the lack of financial transparency within the organization. And then there was that whole scandal in 2004 with CEO Jose Maria Figueres and those undeclared consultancy fees.
Yeah, that definitely raised some eyebrows about their financial practices and whether they were really walking the walk.
Yeah.
Like, it's a reminder that even organizations dedicated to global good can get caught up in these kinds of things.
Yeah. Transparency is so important, especially for an organization with that much influence. Speaking of influence, let's talk about some of the big ideas that the WEF is known for. What about this stakeholder capitalism? We hear that term a lot these days.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely become a core part of their agenda.
Hmm.
The basic idea is to move away from that traditional model where corporations only care about profits for shareholders.
Oh, okay.
Right? It's more about recognizing that businesses have a responsibility to consider everyone who's affected by their decisions. Employees, customers, suppliers, the community, even the environment.
So it's not just about the bottom line, it's about the bigger picture and how business decisions impact everyone.
Exactly. The WEF argues that this kind of holistic approach is actually key to long-term success. They even published a Davos manifesto outlining the principles of stakeholder capitalism.
It sounds pretty idealistic, though. How does that actually play out in the real world? Are there companies who are actually doing this successfully?
Oh, yeah. There are definitely companies embracing these principles and making real changes, like Patagonia, the outdoor clothing company. They're known for their commitment to environmental sustainability and fair labor practices. They even went as far as donating all their Black Friday profits to environmental groups.
Wow, that's impressive. But I imagine it's not always easy to balance the needs of all these different stakeholders. What about the critics who say stakeholder capitalism is just a PR stunt, a way for companies to look good without actually changing anything?
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
There's always the risk of greenwashing, right, where companies use the language of stakeholder capitalism but don't actually back it up with meaningful action. And the WEF itself has been criticized for being too close to corporations. Some people say they become too intertwined with corporate interests.
It's like walking a tightrope, right? Trying to promote this new model of capitalism while also maintaining credibility and independence.
Exactly. And it raises this big question. Can you really reform the system from within, or do we need more fundamental change?
That's a good question. Okay, so we've got stakeholder capitalism, and then there's this whole ESG investing trend. It seems like everyone's talking about ESG these days.
Yeah, ESG has become a major force in the investment world. It stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. And it's a way for investors to evaluate companies based on how sustainable and ethical they are.
So it's like investors putting their money where their values are.
Exactly. They're looking for companies that are not just profitable, but are also doing good for the planet and society. They believe that in the long run, these companies are going to be more successful and resilient.
That makes sense. But I've also heard some pushback against ESG, with some people saying it actually hurts financial returns. What's the truth there?
There's definitely some debate about that. Some studies show that ESG funds have actually done better than traditional funds, while others show the opposite. It's a complex issue, and the data is still kind of up in the air. But it's important to remember that the main goal of ESG investing isn't just to make as much money as possible. It's about aligning your investments with your values and supporting companies that are making a positive impact. And the WEF has been a big advocate for ESG investing, promoting it through their events and initiatives.
It seems like they're really trying to change the whole conversation around business and finance, moving away from a purely profit-driven model to one that's more socially and environmentally conscious.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's a major theme running through all their work. And it ties into their most ambitious and maybe most controversial initiative, the Great Reset.
Oh, yeah. The Great Reset, that's the one that really got people talking. Can you break down what it actually is and what they're trying to achieve?
Sure. The Great Reset is basically a framework for rebuilding the global economy and society after the COVID-19 pandemic. The idea is that the pandemic exposed a lot of flaws in our systems, and we need a fundamental reset to create a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient future.
That sounds huge. What are some of the specific changes they're pushing for?
It's a pretty broad framework, but some key areas they focus on are green investments to fight climate change, strengthening social safety nets to protect the vulnerable, addressing wealth inequality, and promoting global cooperation to tackle shared challenges.
Okay, so on the surface, those sound like good things.
Yeah.
But it's also sparked a ton of criticism, hasn't it? People are worried about too much power being concentrated in the hands of a few, the lack of democratic accountability, and the potential for things to go wrong.
Absolutely. The Great Reset has become this lightning rod for anxieties about globalization, elitism, and the loss of individual freedoms. Critics argue that it gives too much power to unelected individuals and corporations, and that it's basically a top-down agenda being imposed without any real democratic input.
And then you've got social media and populist leaders who are often portraying the Great Reset as some kind of evil plot to control the world.
Yeah, it's become this catchphrase for all sorts of groups, from people worried about government overreach to those full-on conspiracy theorists.
So it's become this really loaded term, and it's hard to separate the legitimate concerns from the more outlandish claims. But it's still important to have these conversations right, to really look at the potential benefits and risks of something this big.
Absolutely. The Great Reset, whether you like it or not, has started this crucial conversation about what kind of future we want and how we get there. It forces us to confront some really fundamental questions about power control and who gets to shape the world.
It's a lot to think about, but I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from stakeholder capitalism and ESG investing to the Great Reset. It's clear that the WEF is trying to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing humanity, but they're also operating in this incredibly complex and controversial space.
That's a good way to put it.
So where do we go from here? What other initiatives are they involved in, and how are they navigating this increasingly polarized world? I guess we'll dive into that next. So we were talking about how the WEF is trying to navigate this increasingly polarized world. What other big ideas are they focused on these days?
Well, one they've been really pushing lately is the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
You know, that idea of digital, physical, and biological technologies all like merging together and changing everything.
So we're talking AI, robotics, biotech, all that stuff.
Exactly. And the WF sees this as a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
It has the potential to solve some of the world's biggest problems, but it could also make inequality worse or even create new kinds of social disruption. They're trying to figure out how to use these technologies for good while minimizing the potential downsides.
That's a pretty tall order. Where do you even start with something that massive?
It's definitely a challenge. The WEF argues that it requires a multi-stakeholder approach. You know, governments, businesses, civil society individuals all working together to shape the future of these technologies. They see themselves as a platform for that kind of dialogue and collaboration.
So they're bringing together people from all these different sectors to try to find some common ground and figure out a way forward.
Right. They host events, publish reports, launch initiatives, all aimed at fostering collaboration and finding solutions. Like one example is their Global AI Action Alliance, which brings together stakeholders from the public and private sectors to develop ethical guidelines for using AI.
It's interesting how they're trying to take on this convening role, bringing everyone to the table to address these complex issues. But it also makes me wonder, how effective can they really be in driving actual change? I mean, they're not a government. They don't have any real power to enforce anything, right?
That's true. Yeah. They don't have any direct power in that sense. But what they do have is influence. They bring together some of the most powerful people in the world: CEOs, political leaders, academics, celebrities. And they create this space for them to discuss, debate, and hopefully find common ground on some of the most important issues facing humanity.
So those discussions, those connections, they can translate into real-world action.
They can. The WEF doesn't just talk about issues, they try to shape outcomes. Think back to their role in facilitating the agreement between Greece and Turkey during that agency dispute. They've also been instrumental in driving progress on global issues like climate change and global health.
Right. We haven't talked much about those areas. What kind of work have they done in those areas?
They've been key players in bringing together governments, businesses, and NGOs to address those challenges. For example, they played a significant role in the Paris Agreement on climate change, helping to build consensus and create momentum for action. And in global health, they've been instrumental in initiatives like the GAVI Vaccine Alliance, which has immunized millions of children around the world.
So they're not just this shadowy organization focused on economics and technology. They're also involved in these humanitarian efforts.
They are. And it's important to acknowledge that they have contributed to positive change in many areas. But it's also important to remember that they operate in this complex space where power, influence, and good intentions can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Right. Those criticisms around elitism, lack of transparency, and corporate influence, those aren't going away anytime soon. It seems like the backlash against the WEF is actually growing.
It is. We're seeing protests, online criticism, and even pushback from some world leaders. It's interesting to see how they're navigating this increasingly hostile environment. They're facing challenges from all sides, from anti-globalization activists to nationalist politicians. It's like they're caught in this tug of war, trying to hold on to their influence while the world around them is becoming more and more fragmented.
So what does the future hold for the WEF? Can they survive this growing wave of opposition? Can they continue to be relevant in this changing world?
It's hard to predict. The WEF is a resilient organization. They've weathered storms before, and they're likely to adapt and evolve to meet the challenges of this new era. But one thing is certain, the world is in a state of flux, and the WEF's role in that changing world is increasingly uncertain.
I guess that uncertainty is part of what makes them so fascinating, right? They're this powerful organization trying to shape the future, but they're also grappling with these huge challenges and facing this growing backlash.
Absolutely. The story of Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum is a story of ambition influence and the constant push and pull between global cooperation and national interests. It's a story that's still being written, and it's one that raises profound questions about the future of our world.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore about the WEF, its impact on the world, and the debates surrounding its agenda.
It's a topic that could keep us talking for hours. But hopefully this has given you a better understanding of the complexities involved and some of the key issues at play.
I think it has. And I hope it sparks some curiosity for you, the listener, to continue exploring this topic. What stood out to you? What further questions do you have about the WF, its influence, and the kind of future we're building? Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Until next time. So we were talking about other initiatives and how the WEF is handling this increasingly polarized world. What other big ideas are they working on right now?
One they've been really into lately is the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Like that idea of digital, physical, and biological technologies all kind of merging and changing everything around us.
So like AI, robotics, biotech, all that.
Exactly. And they see it as this double-edged sword, you know? It could solve some of the world's biggest problems, but it could also make inequality worse or create new kinds of social problems. They're trying to figure out how to use these technologies for good and minimize the bad stuff.
That's a huge challenge. Where do you even begin with something that big?
It is a challenge. The WEF thinks it needs a multi-stakeholder approach. So governments, businesses, civil society individuals, all working together to shape these technologies. They see themselves as like a platform for that dialogue and collaboration.
So they're bringing all these different people together to try to find common ground and figure out a way forward.
Right. Hosting events, publishing reports, launching initiatives, all aimed at getting people to work together and find solutions. One example is their Global AI Action Alliance. It brings together people from the public and private sectors to develop ethical guidelines for AI.
It's interesting that they're trying to take on this role of bringing everyone to the table to address these complex issues. But it makes me wonder, how much can they really change things? I mean, they're not a government. They don't have any real power to make people do anything, do they?
That's true. They don't have that kind of direct power. But they do have influence. They bring together some of the most powerful people in the world, CEOs, political leaders, academics, celebrities, and they create this space for them to talk, debate, and maybe find common ground on the biggest issues facing humanity.
So these discussions, these connections, can they actually lead to real-world change?
They can. The WEF doesn't just talk about issues. They try to shape outcomes. Like, think back to that agreement between Greece and Turkey during that Aegean Sea dispute. They were really instrumental in that. They've also been involved in driving progress on things like climate change and global health.
Right. We haven't talked much about that. What have they done in those areas?
They've been key in bringing together governments, businesses, and NGOs to tackle these challenges. For example, they played a big role in the Paris Agreement on climate change, helping to build consensus and push for action. And in global health, they've been really important in initiatives like the JAVI Vaccine Alliance, which has immunized millions of children around the world.
So they're not just this shadowy organization focused on economics and technology. They're also doing humanitarian work.
Yes. And it's important to recognize they've done good in many areas, but it's also important to remember they operate in this complex space where power, influence, and good intentions don't always lead to the best outcomes.
Right. All that criticism about elitism, lack of transparency, and corporate influence, that's not going away anytime soon. It seems like the backlash against the WEF is actually growing.
It is. There are protests, online criticism, even pushback from world leaders. It's interesting to see how they're handling this increasingly hostile environment. They're facing challenges from all sides, from anti-globalization activists to nationalist politicians. It's like they're in this tug of war trying to hold on to their influence while the world is becoming more and more fragmented.
So what's next for the WEF? Can they survive all this opposition? Can they stay relevant in this changing world?
It's hard to say. They're a resilient organization. They've been through tough times before, and they'll likely adapt and change to meet these new challenges. But one thing's for sure, the world is in a state of flux, and the WS role in that world is getting more and more uncertain.
I guess it's part of what makes them so interesting, right? This powerful organization trying to shape the future, but also facing these huge challenges and a growing backlash.
Definitely. The story of Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum is a story of ambition influence and the constant tension between global cooperation and national interest. It's a story that's still being written, and it raises really important questions about what our world is going to look like.
We've covered a lot, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn about the WEF, its impact, and all the debates surrounding it.
Oh, yeah. We could talk about this for hours.
Uh-huh.
Hopefully, though, this has given you a better understanding of how complex it all is and some of the key issues involved.
I think it has. And I hope it's made you, the listener, want to learn more about it. What stood out to you? What questions do you have about the WEF, its influence, and what kind of future we're building? Keep thinking, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. Until next time.